Her bare feet hit the wet asphalt and she ran. The rain was coming down so hard it felt like the sky was trying to drown Gangnam whole. And Grace Thompson was running through the middle of it with her ivory wedding dress, soaked through, the beaded hem shredded against the pavement, her chest burning with every breath she pulled in. One heel was gone, lost somewhere back on the marble steps of the venue when she first broke into a sprint. The other she had ripped off herself and thrown without looking because slowing down was not an option. Not tonight. Not with those headlights sweeping the boulevard behind her. She didn't look back. She already knew what was back there. 3 black cars. Minho's men. The kind of quiet, efficient people who didn't shout or chase dramatically. They just closed in, methodically like a geometric net, drawing tighter. She had seen them operate before, back when she thought she was on the safe side of Park Min-ho's world. Back when she thought she was his future wife and not his most valuable asset, that had just figured out it was being stolen from. The USB drive was cutting into her palm. She had grabbed it from his laptop with 30 seconds to spare, still in her bridal veil, still with the wedding march playing faintly from the ballroom below. She had sat in that dressing room with the door locked and scrolled through document after document. Patent transfers, legal amendments, ownership reassignments. Every single one bearing her signature. Signatures she had never given. 14 months of her work, her mind, her architecture. All of it quietly, legally, surgically moved into his name while she planned centerpieces and tasted wedding cake. She ran harder. The alley came up on her left and she took it without thinking, slamming her shoulder into the turn, her feet finding broken pavement and glass, and she didn't stop. Couldn't stop, because stopping was what happened right before everything ended. She had learned that the hard way. Twice. She was not learning it a third time. Her eyes caught the building at the end of the alley. 62 floors of titanium and glass, rising out of the Gangnam skyline like something that had decided ordinary architecture was beneath it. Kwon Enterprises. The lights on the upper floors burned cold and white even at this hour, which meant it was never truly closed, which meant it was not safe in any conventional sense of the word. But Grace knew something about that building that nobody alive except its original infrastructure consultant knew. She had put a door in it. 3 years ago, during a cross-project structural survey, she had embedded a harmonic backdoor sequence into the biometric calibration of the sub-basement grid. An emergency failsafe for a flooding scenario that the construction board had been too cheap to build properly. She had done it quietly, documented it nowhere, and forgotten about it the way you forget about a spare key you hid under a rock, until the exact moment you need it more than you have ever needed anything. She looked back once. The headlights were at the mouth of the boulevard. She ran for the building. If you're already hooked, and I know you are, hit that like button right now, because what happens next inside that building? Nobody saw it coming. Stay with me? The sub-basement swallowed her whole. Grace stood on the other side of the final security door, with her back against the wall and her lungs screaming, dripping water onto polished obsidian floors, the emergency lighting casting everything in a low blue-white glow. 3 biometric panels. 3 correct sequences. Her fingers had remembered the geometry perfectly, muscle memory encoded deeper than fear. She exhaled. She was inside. She was safe. She had approximately 4 seconds of believing that before every light in the room came on at once, not the emergency lights. All of them. Simultaneous. Flooding the chamber with the kind of cold, total illumination that leaves nowhere to hide and makes everything exactly as it is. No shadows, no softness, no mercy. And in that light, Grace saw the room for what it actually was. Not a server room. Not a utility basement. A war room. The obsidian table was the length of a shipping container, surrounded by chairs that cost more than most people's cars. Maps covered 2 walls from floor to ceiling. Not the kind you buy, the kind you make, annotated in dense Korean with coordinates, timelines, names circled in red. And at the far head of the table, completely still, one arm resting on the surface beside an unfinished game of glass chess, was a man. He wasn't alarmed. That was the first thing she clocked. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something that has just confirmed a suspicion they'd been sitting with quietly for a while, curious, focused, completely unnervingly calm. Behind him, 6 men had appeared from positions around the room, hands already moving. He raised one finger. One. Everything stopped. Kwon Hajun. Grace knew the name the way everyone in her world knew it, carefully, and with the specific awareness that knowing it too loudly was its own kind of danger. She knew the face from the financial pages she'd studied obsessively during her Seoul fellowship, back when understanding power in this city felt like a survival skill. She had never expected to be standing in front of it soaking wet with no shoes on and a stolen USB drive in her fist. He looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. Then he said, in flawless English, with the tone of a man making a casual observation about the weather, "You came through the sub-basement geometric lock." Grace lifted her chin. Her voice, when it found itself, came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I built it." Something moved behind his eyes. Small. Deep. Like a fault line shifting 1 careful millimeter. "Why?" he said slowly. "Are you running through Gangnam in a wedding dress?" Grace looked at the 6 men. She looked at the maps. She looked at the glass chess queens sitting mid-board, mid-sacrifice, mid-game. Then she reached into the folds of her soaked dress and held up the frequency trigger. "I'll explain after you tell your men to sit down." Hajun looked at the trigger. He looked at her face. He looked at the trigger again. Then he smiled. Not widely. Just a small, controlled movement at the corner of his mouth, the kind that meant he had just encountered something he hadn't calculated for, and instead of unsettling him, it had interested him. He turned to his men and said one word in Korean. They sat down. Grace kept her hand steady. "There are seismic fail-safes hardwired into this building's sub-level pressure system. I know the exact frequency to trip them. The lower 3 floors flood in under 4 minutes. Your servers, your maps, everything on this table, gone." She met his eyes. "I need a place to stay tonight. 1 night. In the morning I disappear, and you never saw me." Hajun picked up the glass chess queen from the board. He turned it between his fingers, studying it the way a jeweler studies a stone he already knows the value of. "1 night," he repeated. "1 night. You break into my building, threaten my infrastructure, and ask for 1 night." He set the queen down. "Here is my counter-offer. You stay for 365 days. Tactical marriage, legal, documented, airtight. You give me access to that mind of yours. I give you protection so complete that whoever is chasing you tonight will never find a door to knock on." Grace stared at him. "You don't know anything about me. I know you built a back door into my building's geometry 3 years ago, and remembered the sequence tonight under extreme duress in the rain." He stood up, and she noticed for the first time how tall he was. Not in a way that was meant to intimidate, but in a way that simply existed, like the building itself. "I know you're holding that trigger with your right hand, and the real weapon, whatever is on that drive in your left, with considerably more care." He crossed the room in 8 slow, even steps and stopped directly in front of her. "I know you're the most interesting thing that has walked into this room in 4 years." She should have stepped back. Every rational signal she had said step back. She didn't. He removed his jacket and draped it over her shoulders in one quiet motion, and the warmth of it hit her so suddenly, so completely, that her throat tightened with something she refused to name. 365 days, she said. "Then I walk." "Then you walk," he agreed. And then, quieter, almost to himself, "If you still want to." Grace pulled the jacket tighter and told herself it was just warmth, just shelter, just a transaction entered into by 2 people who understood how transactions worked. She was very good at telling herself things. The penthouse was 62 floors above the city and felt every inch of it. Grace moved through it the next morning, with her architect's instincts fully awake, cataloguing everything. The ceilings were high and deliberately cold. The furniture was the kind of beautiful that didn't invite you to sit down. Every line in the space was intentional, every angle calculated. It was a room designed to project something rather than hold someone. She recognized the design language because she had used it herself once in her early career, before she understood that spaces built entirely for projection left no room for the person living inside them. She said nothing about any of this. She was given her own wing, her own workspace. A door that locked from her side. These were the terms, and she held onto them like load-bearing walls while she set up her equipment and began the work she had come here to do. Building the most elegant, devastating piece of code she had ever conceived. A Trojan horse so perfectly constructed it would walk through Minho's entire digital empire without triggering a single alarm, right up until the moment it took everything apart. She worked. She was always better when she was working. Hajun was a ghost for the first week, present in the way that structures are present. You knew the building was around you, you felt the weight of it, but the walls didn't speak. When he did appear, it was briefly, efficiently. A file on her desk, a question about her system requirements, a plate of food that appeared outside her door at exactly the hour she forgot to eat, which she chose not to examine too closely. She kept her Korean completely hidden. She had learned the language during her fellowship year and kept it secret ever since, for reasons that had calcified into instinct long before she fully understood them. Powerful people spoke freely in front of women they underestimated. She had gathered more intelligence about her own exploitation from overheard conversations than from any document ever placed in front of her. The language was armor. She didn't remove armor around people she didn't trust yet, and she didn't trust Hajun yet. She told herself that firmly every morning while wearing the muscle memory of his jacket's warmth like a bruise she kept accidentally pressing. This story is only getting heavier from here. You are going to want to be here for what comes next. On the 15th day, she heard it. She was walking the glass corridor outside his office. She took that route to the kitchen every evening because the view of the Han River at that hour was the only soft thing in the entire penthouse. When his voice cut through the door. Low, rapid, Korean. She slowed without meaning to. She heard the word, and it went through her like cold water finding a crack in a foundation. Expendable. She stood completely still in the corridor. His voice continued, quick, clipped, tactical. Something about operational optics and contract integrity and making sure certain information reached certain ears. She didn't absorb all of it. She absorbed the one word that had been following her since she was 22 years old, and her first senior partner had described her to a client as useful for now, in a language he assumed she didn't speak. Expendable. She went back to her room. She pulled her suitcase from under the bed, and she began to fold clothes with a steadiness that was entirely at odds with what was happening in her chest. Because she had a rule. She did not cry while packing. Packing was a choice. Packing meant you were leaving, which meant you were not being left. And the distinction between those two things was the only dignity she had ever been able to guarantee herself. She was almost done when the door opened without a knock. Hajun stood in the frame. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at her face. He didn't say anything for 3 full seconds, which in her experience meant someone was doing rapid calculations, and then he walked past her to the window, crouched beside the curtain rail, and with 2 precise fingers peeled back a strip of trim. Behind it, pressed flat against the wall, barely the width of a thumbnail, a listening device. He held it up so she could see it clearly. Then he closed his fist and crushed it. He stood and crossed to her, and when he spoke, his voice was low and stripped of every layer of professional distance she had heard from him until now. Someone on my inner team is leaking to Minho. I needed to feed them something they'd believe, something cold. His eyes held hers without apology, but also without the blankness she'd expected. There was something underneath, something tired. I knew you understood Korean. I've known since the third day. You navigate every labeled system in this apartment without hesitating. Grace's jaw tightened. So you used my secret to protect your operation. I used your secret to protect you. He said it simply, without drama, like it was a structural fact. There is a significant difference. Not from where I'm standing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then his hand rose and his thumb moved once across her cheekbone, where a tear had broken through the composure she had been engineering for 15 days. It was barely contact. A single, careful motion. It lasted less than 2 seconds and rearranged something in her chest that she had spent years securing in place. You are not going anywhere, Grace. She hated how her hands stopped shaking. She hated even more that she believed him. She didn't unpack the suitcase that night, but she didn't finish packing it either. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark with the city lights cutting geometric patterns across the floor and thought about what it meant that the most honest moment she had experienced in this penthouse had come wrapped in a manipulation she had only survived by accident. She thought about Minho, about all the small moments she had reinterpreted as love that were actually inventory checks, about how she had handed her mind over in pieces, convinced that usefulness and devotion were the same currency. She thought about Hajun's thumb against her cheekbone and the way her body had responded to it like a building that had been braced for impact and felt, for one structural second, held instead. Stop it, she told herself. She was here to finish her code and walk away. That was the entire architecture of this arrangement. She was not going to let warmth confuse her the way it always had. She was not going to mistake being needed for being wanted. Not again. She closed the suitcase and pushed it back under the bed. Not because she trusted him, because she wasn't done yet. 3 weeks later, the code was nearly complete, and Grace had settled into a rhythm that felt dangerously close to normal. She worked from 7 in the morning until the city lights came on. She ate the food that appeared at her door without asking who ordered it. She ran the penthouse corridors at night when she couldn't sleep, mapping the angles of the space the way she mapped every space she spent time in, looking for where the load was held, where the weakness was, where the whole thing might come apart if you pulled the wrong thread. Hajun started appearing in the evenings. Not intrusively, not dramatically. He would come into the main room where she worked, pour 2 glasses of whatever he was drinking, set one near her without comment, and either read or work at the far end of the table. He didn't demand conversation. He didn't perform interest. He simply occupied space near her the way a well-designed structure occupies space, purposefully, without apology, leaving room for what needed to breathe. She started talking first. She still couldn't fully explain why. Your building has a weight distribution problem on the 41st floor, she said one evening, without looking up from her screen. A pause. Excuse me? The eastern facade. Whoever signed off on the final stress calculations either rushed it or didn't understand asymmetric load transfer in high wind conditions. She looked up. You should get it checked before next typhoon season. He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, perfectly seriously, I will fire the entire structural team. Don't fire them. Just make them stay late. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something that wanted to be won and was deciding whether to commit. Noted, he said. She went back to her screen. But the room felt different after that. 3 degrees warmer. 1 wall shorter. The kind of subtle atmospheric shift that happens in spaces when the people inside them stop performing at each other and accidentally become something more like real. She noticed it. She filed it carefully under irrelevant and kept working. She was almost convinced that label would hold. Then she found the dossier. It was buried inside Minho's mirrored server partition, nested behind 3 layers of encryption that had taken her the better part of a week to unpeel. She had been expecting financial records, transfer documents, more evidence of the patent theft she was already building a case around. She was not expecting to find herself. The dossier was thick, chronological. It began 14 months before she ever met Park Min-ho at that rooftop fundraiser where he had seemed so genuinely captivated by her work. Before the first date, before the first time he had looked at her across a dinner table and said, "You are unlike anyone I have ever met," in a tone she had replayed privately for weeks afterward, like a song she was embarrassed to admit she loved. The dossier began 8 months before all of that. Surveillance photographs, academic publications with passages highlighted. A full psychological profile compiled by someone with enough clinical precision to make her skin crawl. Notes on her emotional patterns, her tendency to conflate professional validation with personal worth, her history of overextending herself for people who position themselves as believers in her talent. A handwritten annotation in the margin of one page, in Min-ho's script, that read simply, "She will give everything if she believes it is chosen freely." Grace sat very still for a very long time. Then she kept reading. By the time she reached the final section of the dossier, she had stopped feeling the cold of the room. She had stopped feeling most things. She scrolled through the last few pages with the detached efficiency of a surgeon reading someone else's chart, because falling apart was not something she could afford to do at a server terminal at 2 in the morning with work still left to finish. And then she reached the final document. It was a communication thread, encrypted, but she was past the encryption now, between Min-ho and a private intelligence contractor, dated 11 months ago. The subject line read, "Quan Enterprises, Vulnerability Assessment." She read it 3 times. Then she pushed back from the desk, stood up, and walked out of her wing and straight into her dunes. She didn't knock. He was awake. She registered that first. He was sitting at his own desk in a dark room lit only by monitor light, in a grey shirt with the sleeves pushed up, looking like a man who had not decided whether tonight was for working or for staring at work without doing it. He turned when she entered and read her face in 1 second flat. He started to stand. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She crossed the room and turned his secondary monitor toward him. The dossier was open on her tablet. She set it on the desk in front of him without a word and watched his face as he read. He was very good at stillness. She had noticed that about him from the first night, but as he scrolled through the dossier, through the surveillance photos, through the psychological profile, through the margin notes in Min-ho's handwriting, something moved through him that he didn't fully manage to contain. A tightening around the jaw. A single slow breath that had more weight in it than it should have. He reached the final communication thread and stopped. Grace folded her arms. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and completely level, which was the most dangerous register she owned. "You left the vault code in my infrastructure files." It wasn't a question. Ha-jun set the tablet down. "You recognized Min-ho's operation months before I ran into your building," she continued. "You knew he had targeted me. You knew what he was building toward. And you left a door open." She paused. "Not for me to find in an emergency, deliberately, so that when things fell apart, and you calculated that they would, I would run exactly where you needed me to run." The silence in the room was structural, load-bearing. "You didn't save me, Ha-jun." Her voice cracked on his name just slightly and she hated it, and she kept going anyway. "You collected me. You saw a brilliant algorithm walking around in a person and you decided you wanted it on your side of the board before Min-ho could finish claiming it." She picked up the tablet. "Min-ho used me because I could build him an empire. You did the same thing with better architecture. The method was cleaner. The result is identical. I am sitting in a penthouse that belongs to a man who chose me for my utility and dressed it up as rescue." She stopped. Her throat was tight and her eyes were burning and she absolutely refused to look away from him. "I have spent my entire life being loved most by people who needed something from me. I built Minho an empire because I believed that was what love looked like. Someone who couldn't function without what I could produce. I thought being indispensable was the same as being cherished. Her voice dropped. And I am so tired of being someone's most valuable asset. I am so tired of being collected. Hajun had not moved. He was looking at her with an expression she had no architecture for. Nothing in her catalogue of how powerful men looked at her mapped onto what his face was doing right now. It wasn't calculation. It wasn't the managed neutrality she had come to expect from him. It was something raw and still and slightly undone. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You're right." She blinked. "I did leave the code. I had been watching Minho's operation for 3 months and I knew you were inside it, and I made a decision that was strategic before it was anything else." He stood slowly, not moving toward her, just standing. "That is true. And I am not going to construct a defense for it that asks you to feel something other than what you feel." Grace stared at him. "What I will tell you," he continued, "is that the calculation lasted approximately 72 hours after you walked into that room. After that, it became something I did not plan for and have not been able to categorize since." A pause. "I am not a man who struggles to categorize things." "That's not enough," she said. "I know. You don't get to tell me I matter and have it fix anything. People have been telling me I matter right up until the moment they needed something from me their whole lives." "I know that too." She pressed her lips together. "Then what exactly are you offering me right now?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Nothing. Tonight I'm offering you nothing except the truth, which is that you found it, and you deserve to find it, and I'm not going to ask you to make peace with it on my timeline." She didn't know what to do with that. She had prepared for deflection, for justification, for the sophisticated reframing that men like him deployed the way architects deployed load-bearing columns, to keep the structure standing when the truth threatened to bring it down. She had not prepared for him to simply stand there and hold it with her. She left, without saying anything else. She went back to her wing. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed, because the floor felt more honest than the furniture right now, and she stayed there until the city outside shifted from black to the deep blue that comes just before dawn. She didn't sleep, but she didn't finish packing either. "I need you to stay with me because the next scene is the one that changes everything. Keep watching." She avoided him for 2 days. She worked, she ate. She ran the corridors at midnight and nodded at the security staff who had stopped looking surprised to see her and started looking something closer to fond. She did not go into the main room in the evenings. She did not leave a glass within reach of being filled. On the 3rd day, she went looking for a billiards table. She had noticed it in the east corridor on her first week, a full-size table in a room lined with bookshelves and low lighting. The kind of room that felt like it had been designed by someone who occasionally needed to be somewhere that wasn't the war room. She had never gone in. Tonight she did, because she needed something that was pure geometry, pure physics. No emotion, no history, no subtext, just angles and velocity, and the clean logic of cause and effect. She wasn't particularly good at billiards, but she understood the mathematics of it, and there was comfort in reducing something to mathematics when everything else felt unsolvable. She was leaning over the table working out the trajectory of a bank shot off the far cushion when she heard the door. She didn't look up. "I'm using the room. I can see that." Hajun's voice was different. She registered it immediately, and not in her mind, which was still trying to work out angles, but somewhere lower and more honest. She straightened up slowly. He was standing just inside the door, and he looked wrong. Not wrong in a dangerous way. Wrong in the way that a building looks wrong when you realize the thing holding it together has been under far more stress than the exterior suggested. His jacket was gone. His tie was gone. His knuckles, she noticed with a sharp jolt, were bruised across the right hand. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes like they had been there for days and had stopped trying to hide. She set the cue down. "When did you last sleep?" He moved to the table and picked up a cue without answering, which was itself an answer. He positioned himself across from her, studied the table, and took a shot that should have been simple. Clean angle, obvious geometry. He missed. Grace stared at the table. Then she looked at him. In 3 weeks, she had watched this man operate with a precision that bordered on inhuman. She had never seen him miscalculate anything, not once, not by a millimeter. Hajun. "I'm fine. You just missed a straight bank shot from 40 centimeters. He set the cue against the table and for a moment said nothing. Then, "Minho sent a team. 4 days ago? Not to pressure me. To remove you." He said it with the same tone he used for everything, that leveled architectural calm, but there was something underneath it tonight that the tone wasn't fully covering. "I have been personally coordinating the response. We are contained. You were never in proximity to the threat." Grace's chest did something complicated. "You've been awake for 4 days. 72 hours, approximately. That is not better." He almost smiled. It didn't make it. He moved around the table, ostensibly to line up another shot, and ended up standing close to her, not in the deliberate, weighted way he sometimes occupied space near her, but in the way of someone whose body had quietly given up on maintaining careful distance and hadn't told the rest of him yet. She watched him line up the cue. His hands were steady, but the steadiness was costing him something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a person holding themselves together through sheer architecture of will. She reached over and adjusted his elbow. Just slightly, the correct angle. He went still at the contact, and then something happened that she was completely unprepared for. He lowered the cue, turned slightly, and rested his forehead against her shoulder. Just that. Forehead to shoulder, eyes closed, the full weight of 72 sleepless hours and 4 days of hunting down a threat in complete silence, settling into that single point of contact. He murmured something, quiet enough that she almost lost it. "I set the board. I will own that. But falling for you was not part of any calculation I made." A breath. "It is the one thing in this building that I did not architect." Grace stood very still. Her hand moved before she decided to move it, settling against the back of his head in the softest, most careful motion. The way you touch something you are only beginning to understand the value of, and are terrified of damaging. She didn't say anything. The city moved 62 floors below them, indifferent and bright, and for the length of that silence the room held something that neither of them had a word for yet, but both of them recognized the shape of. She didn't bring it up the next morning. Neither did he. But something had shifted in the penthouse the way foundations shift, invisibly, underground, in ways you don't see until you notice that every door in the building opens differently than it did before. The distance between them had changed its quality. It was still there, but it was no longer a wall. It was more like the space between two structures that have been built close enough to share a load. Grace noticed it in small things. He started leaving his door open when he worked in the evenings. Not an invitation, just open. She started taking her coffee to the main room instead of her wing. Not a concession, just warmer in there. He learned without being told that she needed complete silence before noon and complete noise, music, city sounds, anything, after 10 at night when the quiet got too loud inside her head. She learned without asking that he hadn't slept in a bed for the 4 days he was running the operation against Minho's team, that he had been coordinating from a secondary location she hadn't known existed, and that the bruising on his knuckles was from a situation he described only as a conversation that required physical punctuation. She had laughed at that, genuinely. It had surprised them both. The laugh had hung in the room for a moment afterward, like something neither of them knew the structural load of yet. She filed it carefully. She kept working. The code was finished on a Wednesday. She knew it was finished the way she always knew. Not with celebration, but with a specific quiet that settled over her after something was truly complete. She sat back from her screen and looked at what she had built, and it was, without question, the finest technical work of her career. Elegant in its architecture, devastating in its function. A single keystroke away from dismantling everything Park Min-ho had spent 3 years constructing on the foundation of her stolen work. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt the particular weight of knowing that the thing keeping her here was done. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark. She did not go to the main room that evening, and the door that had recently started being left open was closed when she passed it in the corridor, and she told herself that was fine. That was the arrangement. That was always how this ended. She went to bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about a forehead resting on her shoulder and a voice saying, "I did not architect this." And she thought about the jacket that was still at the bottom of her suitcase. And she thought about the fact that in all the years of her life she had never once been in a room with someone who responded to her anger by saying, "You are right," and then sitting quietly inside the truth of it. She thought about that for a very long time. The charity gala was Hajun's idea, and Grace hated it immediately. "It's a public appearance," he said, over the breakfast she had started eating at the main table instead of her desk. "We are legally married. We have been for 6 weeks. At some point the absence becomes a statement. I don't like galas. Nobody likes galas. People attend galas. I especially don't like galas where Minho will be in the same room." A pause. "He will be there. I know. I have been tracking his calendar for 3 weeks." She looked up from her coffee. "I also know he has been telling people in your industry that our marriage is a performance, a contractual arrangement, that you acquired me the same way you acquire any other strategic asset." Hajun's jaw tightened fractionally. "Who told you that?" "Nobody told me. I speak Korean, remember?" She set her cup down. "He's trying to isolate me, make me look like a transaction, so that if I ever go public with the patent theft, the narrative is already seeded. Unstable foreign woman. Mafia, marriage of convenience. No credibility." She looked at him steadily. "So yes, I'll come to the gala, but I'm not going as your asset. I'm going as someone who has been waiting 6 weeks to look Park Min-ho in the eye." Hajun looked at her for a long moment. "Wear something architectural," he said finally. She almost smiled. "Obviously?" The gala was held in a tower on the Han River waterfront, all glass and cantilever, and the kind of aggressive grandeur that money builds when it wants to be mistaken for culture. Grace arrived in a gown the colour of raw concrete, structured, sharp-shouldered, with geometric cutwork at the waist that made the whole thing look like a building you wanted to walk into. Hajun arrived beside her in black, and she noticed the way the room recalibrated when they entered together, the particular atmospheric adjustment of people revising calculations they had already made. They moved through the room the way two people move when they have learned each other's rhythms without meaning to. He angled himself slightly when she stopped to look at something. She adjusted her position when he was reading a room, giving him the peripheral space he needed without thinking about it. She noticed they were doing it and said nothing. She was scanning for Minho. She found him 40 minutes in, near the east windows, holding a glass of champagne and speaking to two men she recognized as rival developers from her pre-Seoul life. He saw her at the same moment. His face did something quick and unpleasant that he recovered from almost immediately, replacing it with the smooth, practiced warmth she had spent 14 months believing was real. She turned away. "He's moving," Hajun said quietly at her shoulder. "I know. Do you want to leave? I want to stay exactly where I am." She felt him settle beside her, and the steadiness of it was... She didn't have a word for it. Architectural, like a wall that wasn't containing her but was simply there, solid, between her and whatever the weather was doing. Minho arrived at her left side with the confidence of a man who had never fully processed that he had lost. "Grace." He said her name the way he always had. warmly, with the faint suggestion of ownership underneath the warmth, like a landlord greeting a tenant. "You look extraordinary. I've been hoping we'd have a chance to speak." "Have you?" He switched to Korean. Fast, fluid, intended only for her. A sentence constructed with the specific cruelty of someone who believed they were operating in a private frequency. What he said in Korean was this: "Enjoy the evening. The only reason you're standing here is because Kwon needed an interesting piece for his collection. When the year is up, you'll understand that you were furniture in someone else's room, just like you always are." Grace held her champagne glass. She took one breath. Then she turned to Minho and she responded in Korean so precise, so fluid, so completely without accent that the blood visibly left his face. "I want to make sure I understand you correctly," she said in Korean, pleasantly, conversationally, loudly enough for the 4 people nearest them to hear clearly. "You surveilled me for 8 months before engineering a meeting. You compiled a psychological profile identifying my emotional vulnerabilities. You transferred my intellectual property into your name using forged signatures across 14 separate legal documents." She tilted her head. "And your conclusion from all of that is that I am furniture." The silence around them had a radius. "The Trojan horse has been sitting inside your primary server partition for 11 days, she continued, still in Korean, still pleasant. "I haven't triggered it yet, because I wanted to look at you first. I wanted to see if you looked like someone who understood what was coming." She studied his face. "You don't." Minho's jaw worked. "You wouldn't." "I'm sorry, should I switch back to English? I want to make sure everyone present understands you clearly." She switched to English. "Park Min-ho has been committing intellectual property theft against me for over a year. I have documentation. I have server records. I have your handwriting in the margins of a psychological profile you commissioned to determine the most efficient way to exploit me." She looked at him with something that wasn't anger. Anger had burned off somewhere between the billiards room and this moment, leaving something cleaner and more precise behind. "I am not furniture, I am the architect. And I designed the door you cannot get out of." From somewhere behind her right shoulder she heard Hajun say, in English, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Checkmate." Minho left the gala 17 minutes later. Grace stood at the window with her champagne and looked at the Han River and felt the specific interior quiet of someone who has put down a weight they have been carrying so long they had stopped noticing it was there. Hajun appeared beside her. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there, looking at the river with her. Then he said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" "Dismantle someone with perfect grammar." "The same place I learned everything," she said. "I built it myself." He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, in a tone that was so simple and so unguarded that it landed somewhere completely undefended in her chest, "I know. I have known since the first night." A pause. "That is not why I want you to stay." She looked at him. "Then why?" she said softly. He looked back at her and for once there was no calculation in his face, no management, no architecture, just a man standing next to a window telling the truth in the only register he had left. "Because the penthouse is 3 degrees warmer when you're in it. Because you told me my building had a structural flaw, and you were right and I didn't fire anyone, I just made them stay late. And that was the first time in 4 years someone made me laugh, and I didn't plan for it." He paused. "Because you pack your suitcase and don't finish, and I notice every time, and it is the most terrifying thing that happens in that building." Grace looked at the river. "That's a lot of words for a man who usually uses about 12, she said. "You make me use more." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Minho is going to retaliate. I know. It'll get worse before the code takes him down. I know that too. And you're telling me you want me to stay anyway." He turned to look at her fully. "I am telling you that I want you to stay because of who you are, and not because of what you can build." And I understand those sound like the same thing when you have spent your entire life having them treated as the same thing. So I'm not asking you to believe me. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking you to let me show you the difference, however long that takes. The river moved below them, indifferent and constant. Grace Thompson, who had built doors into buildings for emergencies she hoped would never come, who had learned languages as armor and packed suitcases as power, and spent 29 years making herself indispensable to people who called her expendable when they thought she couldn't hear. She looked at Hajun Kwon, and for the first time in longer than she could calculate, she chose to stay not because she had nowhere to go, but because she wanted to see what happened next. Show me then, she said quietly. The city burned below them, geometric and relentless and full of light. 3 days after the gala, Minho made his move. Grace was in her workspace at 7 in the morning, coffee cooling beside her keyboard, when the alert hit her secondary monitor. A flag she had built into the Trojan horse's early warning system, a tripwire designed to notify her if Minho's team attempted to access the partition where she had embedded the code. Someone was in the partition, not accessing it, dismantling it. She sat forward. Her fingers moved fast, pulling up the diagnostic layer, and what she found made her stomach drop in the specific way it dropped when a structure she had designed was being attacked at its foundation. Minho had a countercoder, someone good. Not as good as her, but good enough to have found the partition's outer shell in 11 days, which meant he had resources she hadn't fully mapped. She was already rebuilding the defensive layer when her phone lit up. "Unknown number," she answered. The voice was synthetic, digitally altered, but the cadence was Minho's. She had spent 14 months learning the rhythm of how he constructed sentences, and you didn't unlearn that. "The deepfake is already rendered," the voice said. 40 minutes of footage. You coordinating a cyber attack on 3 financial institutions across 2 continents. The metadata is clean. The timestamps are verified. It goes to Interpol, to the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit, and to every major news platform simultaneously unless Kwon Enterprises signs a full asset transfer within 24 hours. Grace kept her voice completely level. "You're overextending." "I'm finishing what I started. You were always going to be collateral, Grace. I just gave you 14 months to feel like a protagonist first." The call ended. She sat for exactly 4 seconds doing nothing. Then she picked up her coffee, took a long sip, set it down, and walked to Hajun's wing. He was already awake, already dressed. Already she realized when she saw the look on his face. Aware. "How long have you known?" she said. "The deepfake has been in production for 9 days. We found the rendering lab on day 7. He looked at her directly. "I didn't tell you because I was handling it." "Hajun." "I know. We talked about this. After the dossier. We talked about—" "I know, Grace." He said her name differently than he used to. She had noticed that weeks ago and kept filing it under irrelevant where it kept refusing to stay. "I made a decision, and it was the wrong one, and I am telling you that clearly." She pressed her lips together. "Is the rendering lab still operational?" "No." "The footage?" 3 copies exist. 2 are on servers we have located. The third—" He paused. "The third is on a device we haven't found yet. So it's not handled." "Not entirely." She turned and walked back to her workspace. The next 18 hours were the most technically demanding of her life. Minho's countercoder had done real damage to the Trojan horse's outer partition. Not enough to dismantle the core payload, but enough to force her to rebuild the delivery architecture from a different angle. She worked with the kind of focus that closed everything else out. The kind she had developed in graduate school when she would forget to eat for entire days because the problem in front of her was more vivid than anything else in her sensory field. Hajun brought food at noon. He set it beside her without speaking and left without asking anything. At 3 in the afternoon, she hit a wall, a specific type of encryption on Minho's countercode that she hadn't encountered before. She sat back and stared at it, and thought about it the way she thought about structural problems, looking for where the load was held, where the logic had to be true even if it wasn't visible. She heard the door and didn't look up. "I need 20 minutes of silence." "Take 30, Hajun said. She heard him settle into the chair at the far end of the workspace. He had started doing that, occupying the far corner when she was deep in something, present without intruding. She had stopped finding it strange approximately 2 weeks ago. She found the flaw in the encryption at the 17-minute mark. It was elegant, honestly. She could appreciate the craftsmanship even as she was taking it apart. Minho's coder had built the protection around a false center, a decoy partition designed to absorb attack while the real core sat 3 layers sideways. It was good work. It just wasn't good enough because Grace had been building false centers into her own architecture for years, and she knew exactly how the logic had to sit underneath them. She rebuilt the delivery pathway in 40 minutes. She ran the diagnostic, clean, complete. The Trojan horse was intact, rehoused and ready. She sat back. "It's done." Hajun looked up from the far corner. "The code is ready. The moment Minho goes live with anything, the deep fake, any press statement, any financial move, I can trigger it from anywhere with a single command." She looked at the screen. "But the 3rd copy of the deepfake is still out there." "Yes. So we need to pull him into the open. Make him think he has won enough to go public." She turned to look at Hajun. "Which means he needs to think he has leverage over you specifically, not just me." A pause. "What are you thinking?" Hajun said slowly. "I'm thinking we give him the one thing that would make him move fast and stop being careful." She held Hajun's gaze. "He needs to believe you have discarded me, publicly, completely, that I am no longer under your protection and the leverage has worked." The room was very quiet. Hajun looked at her for a long moment. She watched him understand what she was proposing, watched him calculate it, watched something cross his face that he didn't manage to keep entirely internal. "No," he said, "it's tactically—" "No, Grace. Hajun, if we can get him to go public with the deepfake before it reaches any official channel, the Trojan horse activates and every piece of evidence I've compiled deploys simultaneously. He destroys himself. Everything he's built collapses in real time in front of an audience." She leaned forward. "But he won't move until he believes I'm exposed. He's too careful. He'll wait until he thinks I have no protection, and the narrative he's seeded makes me look unstable enough that nobody will—" "I heard you." His jaw was tight. "I understand the tactic. I am telling you no. It's my choice. Not this one. Every choice about my safety is my choice. That was the arrangement." "The arrangement," he said, and there was something in his voice she had never heard from him before. Not anger, but something close to its opposite, something that was anger turned entirely inward. "Is not the only thing operating in this room right now, and you know that." Silence. Grace looked at him. He looked back. The space between them held the weight of everything they had not said directly yet, all the things filed carefully under irrelevant that had been accumulating for weeks into something neither of them had fully named. "It will work," she said, more quietly. "I know it will work. That is not the point." "Then, what is the point?" He stood up from the chair and crossed the room and stopped close to her. Not in the carefully measured way he used to maintain distance, but close in the way of someone who has stopped pretending distance is something they want. "The point," he said quietly, "is that I spent 72 hours hunting men who came here to hurt you, and I would spend 72 more, and 72 more after that, and I am not going to be the mechanism that puts you in front of them voluntarily." Grace looked up at him. "Even if I want you to," she said softly. "Especially then." She held his gaze for a long moment, then she looked at the screen, then she looked back at him. "There's no other way to guarantee he moves before he has time to find a channel for that footage," she said. "If we wait him out, he gets careful again and the 3rd copy disappears somewhere we can't find it. And this doesn't end." He was quiet for a very long time. 12 hours, he said finally. You are on my island before he makes any move. Your physical safety is absolute and non-negotiable. Everything else, the plan, the trigger, the timing, you control. And the annulment papers. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Yes. It has to be public. He has to see documentation. I understand. Hajun. She said his name and waited until he looked at her. Really looked at her, without the management or the architecture. This is a chess move. It is not the truth. You understand that. He looked at her for a long, still moment. I know what it is, he said quietly. I also know that sitting across a table from you and sliding papers toward you is going to require every piece of composure I have built in 35 years. Then we make it fast. Then we make it fast, he agreed. She nodded. She turned back to the screen. She began preparing the trigger sequence, the final beautiful architecture of everything she had been building since the night she ran through Gangnam Rain in a ruined wedding dress. She heard him move toward the door. Hajun. He stopped. She didn't turn around. When this is over, when Minho is finished, and the code has run, and the dust has settled, she paused. I want to fix the weight distribution problem on your 41st floor. A silence. Then, so quietly she almost lost it beneath the hum of the servers. I was hoping you'd say something like that. Don't you close this video. The ending of this story is the most beautiful thing and you are 3 minutes away from it. Stay. Right. There. The penthouse was very quiet the evening Hajun slid the annulment papers across the table. Grace had dressed carefully. Not in armour. She was done with armour, but in something real. A deep rust-coloured dress, clean lines, no performance in it. She sat across from Hajun at the obsidian table where she had first stood dripping and barefoot and furious 6 weeks ago. And she looked at the papers, and she looked at his face, and she was struck, not for the first time, by the specific beauty of a person who was doing something that cost them something without asking to be credited for the cost. His face was a mask. She knew that. She also knew the face behind the mask now, and knowing it made the mask harder to look at. She picked up the pen. Minho's people are watching the building's external feeds, Hajun said. His voice was even, professional, the voice of a transaction. We have confirmed surveillance on 3 separate angles. Good. My men will escort you to the lower entrance in 20 minutes. The car will take you to the private terminal. I know the plan. Grace. She looked up. His mask had slipped. Not dramatically. Just enough. Just a fraction of a millimetre in the set of his jaw, in the way he was looking at her like a man memorising something. Be on the island when I get there, he said. Quiet. Direct. No performance in it at all. She signed the papers. She held his gaze for 1 more second. Then she stood, and his men appeared at the door, and she walked out of the penthouse without looking back, because if she looked back she would not be able to walk forward, and they needed her to walk forward for this to work. The car was cold. The terminal was quiet. The jet lifted into the Seoul night, and Grace sat with her tablet in her lap and the trigger sequence open on the screen, and she thought about geometry and foundations and the specific courage it took to build a door in a wall that you weren't sure anyone would ever use. 40 minutes into the flight, the pilot's voice came through the cabin. Mrs. Kwon, we're beginning our descent. The jet banked left, dropping through cloud, and through the window she saw it. An island, dark and green, and surrounded by black water, with lights burning along the shore in a pattern that looked from this altitude almost like a blueprint. The wheels touched down, the door opened, and Hajun was on the tarmac. No jacket, no mask, just him, standing in the island wind with his hands at his sides and an expression she had never seen on his face in any boardroom or war room or billiards room, open and certain and slightly undone in the way that certainty sometimes undoes people when they have finally stopped fighting it. She came down the steps. He crossed the tarmac in the same 8 measured steps he had crossed his war room 6 weeks ago, and she remembered thinking then that he moved like a building existed, with intention, with permanence. And she thought it again now, and then she stopped thinking because he reached her, and his hands found her face, and he kissed her with the specific desperation of someone who has been holding something enormous very carefully for a very long time, and has finally, completely, put it down. She kissed him back, her hands fisted in his shirt. The island wind moved around them, indifferent and warm. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers, and they stood like that for a moment in the dark, breathing the same air. "The trigger," he said finally, quietly. She pulled out her tablet without stepping back from him. One screen, one command. She typed the final sequence with his forehead still against hers. She hit send. 8,000 kilometers away, in a glass tower in downtown Seoul, Park Min-ho stood at a podium in front of cameras and journalists and the full assembled weight of an empire he had stolen piece by piece from a woman he had decided was furniture. His screens came alive. Not with his presentation, with hers. Document after document, transfer record after transfer record, the psychological profile with his handwriting in the margins, the communication threads, the forged signatures laid against originals in side-by-side comparison that left absolutely no interpretive room. And then, across every screen simultaneously, in the clean geometric typography that was unmistakably Grace Thompson's design language, a single line. Checkmate. Mrs. Kwon. Min-ho's microphone was still live. The room heard everything. 6 months later, Seoul was warm, and the Han River caught the evening light like something that had been waiting all day to be looked at properly. Grace stood on the penthouse balcony with a coffee she had been letting cool for 20 minutes because sometimes the view was more important than the temperature. The city spread out below her in its geometric grid, all angles and intersections, and the beautiful logic of 1,000 structures built by people who believed that what they made could hold something worth holding. She heard the door. Hajun appeared behind her, and his arms came around her from behind in the easy, unhurried way of someone who has stopped calculating the distance between himself and the thing he wants to be near. He pressed his lips to her temple and stayed there for a moment. "The 41st floor is fully reinforced," he said. "The structural team sends their regards and their sincere apologies. I told you not to fire them. I didn't fire them. I simply made clear that your assessment of their work was the professional standard they should aspire to." She laughed softly. The city moved below them. "If you had found another door that night," he said quietly against her temple, "if the geometry had led you somewhere else, would you still have—" "I would have torn down the walls to build one," she said, simply, without hesitation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back from her and she turned, and he was on one knee on the balcony with the Seoul skyline behind him and a ring in his hand. Not a transaction, not a contract, just a diamond set in clean architectural lines, custom, precise, the kind of beautiful that had been designed for one specific person and no one else. "No contracts," he said. "No utility. No calculation." His eyes stayed on hers. "Just you. Just this. Just the rest of whatever we build from here." Grace Thompson, who had once believed that love was what happened when you made yourself impossible to replace, looked at Kwon Hajun, who had been on the other side of a door she built years ago for an emergency she hadn't known yet was coming, and she said yes. Not because she needed the shelter, not because she needed the protection, not because she was useful or brilliant, or the most interesting thing that had walked into a room in 4 years, but because he was the first person who had ever asked her to stay and meant her. The whole architecture of her, the fear and the armor and the laughter and the code and the bare feet on the wet pavement and all of it. And that, she had finally learned, was what a foundation actually felt like. Fade to black. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in Grace's story felt like yours, drop a comment below and tell me which scene hit hardest. Subscribe for more stories like this one. Share it with someone who needs to hear that being chosen for who you are, not what you can build, is not too much to ask for. It never was. I'll see you in the next one.